stories yesterday of vast amounts of Russian troops being cornered and destroyed in the Dnipro River. Similarly, around Petrovsk, the Russians gathered a large force to try and attack there. They were pretty much destroyed completely by Ukrainian forces. So there doesn't seem to be any good news for Russian forces at the moment. So it may well be that President Zelensky is right there, and his major attack he's conducting at the moment, may be part of a wider plan.
Hamish, the Bretton-Gordon is a retired British Army colonel, former commander of NATO's and UK's chemical, biological, radiological and nuclear reaction troops. Welcome to our program, Colonel Hamish.
Thank you very much for having me.
15 Russian regions across Russia, including Moscow, are now under heavy attack using Ukrainian long-range drones, missiles, and under attack of British-made Storm Shadow cruise missiles, according to the recent reporting from the Russian media. From your perspective, is Ukraine taking its own fate in its own hands right now by launching this attack right after the White House meeting and Trump-Putin phone call?
Well, yeah, let's hope that it is as significant as what it appears on the face of it. We know how successful the deep strikes by Ukraine have been into Russia and crippled the oil industry, and particularly the petrol refining industry. And I think a lot of people were a little bit disappointed by the outcome of President Zelensky's meeting with President Trump in the White House last Friday, when people like myself were writing that the Americans should give Ukraine the long-range Tomahawk cruise missiles, which would make a huge difference. But it was pointed out by many people that actually Ukraine possesses its own indigenous long-range missiles, which have been incredibly effective. And if the Ukraine military have managed to concentrate this force and, as it would appear, attack 15 different regions, this could be a very major statement. We know also out of the meeting in Washington last week that President Trump has been speaking to President Putin on the phone, and they are organizing potentially to meet in Budapest in Hungary in the near future to try and come to some peace negotiation. But if Ukraine has managed to strike a major blow deep into Russia, this could be the most effective way to make sure that those talks in Budapest have real meaning to them. So, I think from a Ukraine perspective and from a European perspective, a major offensive like this, if it is as successful as some of the previous deep strikes by Ukraine into Russia, then that might well hasten Putin to the negotiation table quicker than most other things.
Ukraine has launched at least 58 attacks on Russia's energy sites since the start of August, sending drones as far as about 1,200 miles deep inside Russia to bomb refineries and other Russia's key infrastructure targets, according to the recent reporting by Reuters. From your perspective, do you feel that even more pressure is being made to force Putin to be at the negotiating table and to accept this possible offer from President Trump, because this could be a possible way out from this war, also for Russian dictator Vladimir Putin to survive and hold his power?
Well, it's certainly the case that the Ukrainian deep attacks into Russia are having a real impact. It's difficult to gauge exactly how much the Russian oil industry has been affected, but even Russian telegram channels are reporting a shortage of petrol, people queuing. There's also discontent. There are reports, again, in the Russian media of people protesting in St. Petersburg and other major cities about this very thing. It's seems clear as well that actually President Putin is now having to import petrol into Russia, which is almost unheard of even a few months ago, to keep Russian cars and lorries moving. And the other significant element, the oil industry for Russia, it's where it gets a lot of its foreign currency that keeps its war machine going. And it's difficult to gauge how much the oil industry has been damaged and destroyed, but the upper figure of 40% and a lower figure of 20%, either one of those is massively significant when you consider how important it is to the Russian economy. So let us hope that what we're hearing at the moment will really convince Putin that negotiation is the only way out of this, because he's made it pretty clear that he's not interested in peace. In fact, his peace plan, which would see Ukraine giving up the whole of the Donbass, is even completely unacceptable, I'm sure, to the Ukrainian people, and even us in Europe can realize that's unacceptable. So hitherto, Putin has not declared a viable peace option here. But if he runs out of oil and runs out of petrol, and the protests get stronger, then it may well be this is going to be the most effective way to get that unilateral and comprehensive ceasefire that President Zelensky has been calling for months now. It doesn't seem any other way is going to stop Putin attacking into Ukraine, but this might well be, and certainly at the moment looks the most realistic way of getting some sort of ceasefire. And with the summit with Trump coming up in Budapest shortly, timing hopefully is on Ukraine's side.
Also, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky says that the war in Ukraine is close to ending. Is he right?
Well, let's hope he's right, and he probably knows more than most. I think when you look at it in the round, all the sort of comments and views coming out of the Kremlin would not lead you to believe that. But actually, when we see the state of the Russian army at the moment, the amount of casualties they've had, and the fact that they haven't really managed to do anything, the stories yesterday of vast amounts of Russian troops being cornered and destroyed in the Dnipro River. Similarly, around Petrovsk, the Russians gathered a large force to try and attack there. They were pretty much destroyed completely by Ukrainian forces. So there doesn't seem to be any good news for Russian forces at the moment. So it may well be that President Zelensky is right there, and his major attack he's conducting at the moment, may be part of a wider plan. So let us hope the president is on the right track here, because I think everybody would want to see a peace deal that is just for the Ukrainian people as soon as possible.
You just mentioned about Russia's losses on the ground in Ukraine. Unfortunately, world's media does not cover this too much right now. However, Ukraine still conducts successful counteroffensive on the ground, and many Russia's brigades are being cornered and face serious, difficult situation. Could you please provide us with more your assessment of this situation on the ground, with Russian troops being encircled somewhere and Ukraine taking into account Ukraine's local successes there?
I think generally across the 800, 900 mile contact line, the front line, as it were, not a great deal has happened, and certainly the lines haven't moved. I mean, there have been some fighting in the Kharkiv area. Again, any Russian advances have been very quickly counterattacked by the Ukrainian forces. The main focus seems to have been in the Petrovsk area, where we understood about 90,000 Russian forces, up to 300 tanks, were gathered in the last couple of weeks. A major assault was made about a week ago, but actually the Ukrainian forces in the area held firm, and any small gains the Russians made were quickly won back. And we understand from the UK's Ministry of Defence intelligence update that Russia suffered very large casualties, over 1,000 a day, and we understand that those 300 tanks, most of them no longer exist. So it's any small areas that the Russians have managed to concentrate force and have attacked have been very quickly beaten back. So when I look at it with my tank commander's hat on and my military hat on it, I think there's very little prospects of the Russians making any significant gains at all across the front. And, they are short of soldiers and very short of trained soldiers. It's all very well grabbing people out of jails and throwing them to the front, but unless they know what they're doing, they are really just cannon fodder. And, it is pretty sad looking on that President Putin is quite happy to throw Russian and anybody else who will fight for him into the meat grinder, and these kids have little chance of surviving for very long. So I would say that we are pretty much at stalemate. I would assess, and we've discussed before, that the Russian army has reached its culminating point. In other words, it really has run out of the ability to do much more. And one would have thought that might be a reason for Putin to go for a ceasefire to regroup, which he still hasn't got yet. I suppose he thinks that if Ukraine gives up the Donbass for a peace deal, then if Putin controlled the Donbass, he would basically have a direct route into Kyiv, which no doubt he would take. So I think all in all, we have this sort of stalemate, and let us hope that the destruction of the Russian oil industry is enough to make Putin realize that a ceasefire and a peace deal is the only way ahead.
Let's also get back to Trump-Zelensky meeting. According to Financial Times reporting, President Trump urged Volodymyr Zelensky to accept Russia's terms to cede Donbass to Russia in this White House meeting last Friday, warning that Vladimir Putin would destroy Ukraine if it did not agree to this. What is your take on that? Because Russia hasn't been able to destroy Ukraine since the beginning of this full-scale war.
Well, it's very difficult to unpick this in a positive way. I think President Trump is buoyed by his peace deal in the Middle East, and he seems to think that anything he says, people will listen to and act on. And it's clear that he wants a quick peace deal in Ukraine. But quite rightly, the Ukraine president and the Ukrainian people and all of its allies like ourselves realize that, it's just ridiculous to expect Ukraine to give up the Donbass, as President Putin has said is the requirement, because, at the moment, a good sort of 30-40% of the Donbass is still very much in Ukraine military hands. It's the key bastion. It's a key defensive area. And without the Donbass, the route to Kyiv is pretty straightforward. So I think, the meeting and the description by President Trump is way off the mark. I agree. I don't think there is any way the Russians are going to destroy the Ukraine military anytime soon. Even if they use their most extreme weapons, their nuclear weapons, I don't think there's any chance of them doing that. I think President Trump is trying to force a quick peace onto President Zelensky, and President Zelensky has realized this and pushed back. So we know that President Trump does change his mind very, very regularly, and perhaps what is happening at the moment will convince President Trump that actually he needs to make Putin or drag Putin to the negotiation table and force him to sign a peace deal, rather than leaning on President Zelensky and the Ukrainian people all the time. Because, I think Trump is way off the mark. Ukraine is a long way from being defeated, and I don't see the Russians have the ability to destroy the Ukraine army today, tomorrow, or anytime soon.
So even if Russia uses nuclear weapons, it will not be able to completely destroy Ukraine. However, Russia has been using this nuclear rhetoric for a while. Do you feel that these nuclear threats are working on President Trump's mind and his stance on Ukraine?
Yeah, I mean, I'm sad to say I do think the threats coming out of Moscow about nuclear are having an impact not only on President Trump, but probably also on some Western leaders as well. Because I think it's pretty clear you can't fire one nuclear weapon. That is just not how these things work. And I think Trump realizes that if Putin fires a nuclear weapon, then he's going to have to do something pretty similar too. These are not weapons that you use in isolation or individually. But we all know and can all imagine how desperate a nuclear strikes would be. And shamelessly, that is what Putin and his spokesmen like Medvedev and Peskov are using. And shamelessly also, Western leaders and Putin are believing it. So I think it is a complete distraction, but it's working. And that's why the Russians keep on pushing that particular button. And it's time that the likes of President Trump most especially, but also European leaders like Prime Minister Starmer realize this and front up, because Putin knows as clear as anybody else, if he fires a nuclear weapon of any description, that's it. It's over for him, and let's hope not for everybody else.
Because in such case, US and European allies would have to retaliate to deter Putin from using another nuclear weapons in such case, because it's dangerous ground to enter even for such reckless dictator as Vladimir Putin.
Oh, entirely. And even if Putin fired one tactical nuclear weapon into Ukraine, I think the West has already said it would respond with a massive conventional attack. And I think even Putin knows that 1,000 Tomahawk missiles fired towards him and all his nuclear facilities would completely destroy his capability to keep going. So I don't, one nuclear weapon fired by Putin, I don't think you'll get a nuclear response from Europe and the US, but you would get an overwhelming conventional response that really would put an end to Russia's special military operation. And I'm pretty sure Putin knows that. Unfortunately, Western leaders don't seem to have the confidence to back up the rhetoric as the Russian experts are doing at the moment.
Also, according to Financial Times, Trump told Zelensky that Putin had told him the conflict was a special military operation, not even war. What is your reaction to this? Because isn't it hilarious how this so-called special military operation is almost entering its fourth year?
It's ridiculous. The war in Ukraine looks more like the First World War than virtually any other war we've seen in the last 100 years, with over 1 million. The last figure I heard was 1,300,000 Russian casualties. Now, these are First World War rates. To say that this is just a military operation, I think shows how callous and evil the Russian leader is. This is war in any description, in any language. This is not a special military operation. This is war, and it needs to be dealt with like that. And if President Trump and some Western leaders believe this is just a military operation, then they need to have a really deep look at themselves, because this is war, and this is one of the most horrific wars that we have seen on the planet in the last 100 years.
It is interesting also that Vladimir Putin was trying to persuade Donald Trump that Russia was winning this war, not losing it. From your perspective, was Putin so successful in that? And did Trump believe in his words? Did he believe his words?
Well, unfortunately, he certainly seems to believe some of it. His reaction. One of his comments, as we discussed earlier, is saying that Ukrainians need to go for a peace deal that Putin's offering at the moment, otherwise they'll be destroyed. That, as we've discussed, is just not even likely at the moment. So I think one needs to react accordingly. There is no way, in my mind, at the moment, that Russia will be able to win this war. Unfortunately, Putin seems to have convinced Trump that they can do, and Western leaders have not been able to convince Trump that actually Ukraine, far from losing at the moment, is actually getting onto the front foot. It seems it is a desperate situation where the Russian president seems to have more sway over the American president than the Western allies who America relies on so much. But as we've discussed many times, Trump changes his mind as often as the wind changes direction. So let's hope that when he comes across the pond again to try and do a peace deal, he realizes what the real situation is. And with President Zelensky offering an unconditional ceasefire now for the last 6 months, it is Putin that really needs to be brought to the peace table rather than the Ukrainian president. And President Trump needs to realize that, and quickly.
Also, it seems like Vladimir Putin was successful in talking out Trump of providing Ukraine with Tomahawk missiles. Putin was so active in trying to prevent Trump from sending such missiles to Ukraine. Does this mean that such missiles pose an existential threat to Putin's regime?
Well, I think it's very interesting looking at the reaction of Putin and his close advisors to the Tomahawk missile. On the one hand, they're saying this is an old missile, it won't make a difference. And then on the other hand, they're saying, this will change the war and will lead Russia to do whatever it requires. So it's pretty clear that actually the Russian military and those close to Putin think that Tomahawk missiles are an existential threat. And I think they would be if they were given in sufficient numbers. We're talking about thousands, not hundreds. A couple of hundred would probably not make a difference. But psychologically, the Tomahawk missile is a winner for the Ukrainians if they can get it. And it's a winner for Putin if he can prevent the Americans from allowing the Ukrainians to use it. So in that way, it's a hugely significant weapon. And I think the final thing to say on this, that Trump didn't completely take Tomahawk missiles off the table. He did say on Friday that if peace cannot be found in other ways, and Tomahawk missiles are the only way to get peace, then he may well consider sending them to Ukraine. So I think they are still a significant player here. And whether they are this great game changer that some people think is neither here nor there. Psychologically, I think for both sides, they are a game changer. And psychologically, it would be really advantageous for Ukraine to be able to use these weapons.
Let's cover also recent breaking news. According to NBC News reporting, both the US administration and Russia have halted their preparations for the summit between Trump and Putin in Budapest. Could this mean that Trump has finally called Putin's bluff and understood that there would not be any kind of progress from that meeting?
Well, it's difficult to say. As you say, there's a bit of information that the pre-negotiations have been halted between the Russian Foreign Ministry and the Secretary of State, Rubio, and people seem to be reining back a little bit. In the very first instance, when Trump mentioned the meeting in Budapest, some people, I included, thought it might be a double bluff. So we are yet to see. I think whatever happens in the next few days and weeks are going to be hugely significant. it did strike me a bit strange of having a meeting in Budapest. Budapest, of all places, of course, where the US and the UK and Russia guaranteed Ukraine's safety if Ukraine gave up its Soviet-era nuclear weapons. If Ukraine still had nuclear weapons, we would not be talking like this. Putin would never have invaded. So I expect there's quite a lot to play out on this at the moment, and we shall see. But if it means that Trump is suddenly realizing that actually the devil and the aggressor in this is Putin, and he's the one who needs to be flexible and move, then maybe that is a good thing, because I don't think there is any way that the Russian military are going to destroy the Russian military anytime soon. And actually, the longer things go on at the moment, it strikes me that Ukraine is making far more progress, and the Russians are the ones who really should be looking at the peace negotiation table as soon as possible. Otherwise, the tide could turn significantly in Ukraine's favour. So there's a lot of knowns at the moment, but probably even more unknowns.
Let's also cover the situation on the Middle East. How could this deal between Hamas, Israel, and the US influence ongoing Trump's efforts in Ukraine?
Well, I think it's had a significant impact on President Trump psychologically. He obviously has taken great delight from the successful peace deal, and to be fair to him, it seemed improbable, even a few weeks and months ago. So his confidence is sky high when it comes to peace deals, and now that deal is done, obviously there's an awful lot to happen still. I think a lot of people were hoping that he'd focus more on getting a peace deal for Ukraine. So I think that's the major impact probably there, of putting the focus of the American administration back into Ukraine. I think as far as any direct links to what's happening in the Middle East and what's happening in Europe and Ukraine, are probably pretty tenuous. But I think the main thing is everybody's hoping the Americans will focus on bringing Putin to the peace negotiation table now that they have sort of done the unthinkable and created peace between Hamas and the Israeli government.
And could this lead to any kind of lasting peace in the Middle East, this ceasefire deal?
Well, I'm somebody who spent many, many years in the Middle East, and I'm slightly more upbeat than I have for many years, because some of the main protagonists, the Iranians, are pretty much a spent force militarily these days. Their militias, Hezbollah, the Houthis and Hamas, are now much diminished and really don't have the capability to create significant terror, certainly outside their territories. So I think, and with key players like the Saudis and the Qataris looking to lead the way, it strikes me that the opportunity for a longer and lasting peace in the Middle East is much more positive today than perhaps it was a year ago. So the thorny issue of Gaza, the West Bank, the Israelis and the Palestinians has always been the powder keg to set the Middle East on fire. At the moment, it seems to be under control, and there is some prospect that it will be a lasting peace. It definitely won't be perfect, and there'll be a lot of other issues, no doubt, to deal with. But yeah, I think in sum, I'd say for somebody who's spent many, many years in the Middle East, I'm more confident now of a lasting peace in this region than I have for many, many years.
And could this deal work without any kind of stabilization force on the ground?
Well, that's a really good question. I don't think it can. And we're already seeing clashes with Hamas and other rebel groups in Gaza, and also with the Israeli Defense Force. History tells us actually to have a neutral force, stabilization force as we're calling it, is usually the most effective way in order to stop the fighting and also to get the humanitarian aid in and get the infrastructure repaired and rebuilt. So, yeah, I think a stabilization force is key to this. It was part of President Trump's 10-point plan for the Middle East. The UN also agree it's the way ahead. I expect there's a challenge on getting the right force together that can be effective. But yeah, I think in order to get a lasting peace that both sides can agree with and support, having a neutral stabilization force in the middle is probably the most effective way of ensuring that this is an enduring peace agreement that has been signed up by all the sides at the moment.
Also, you just mentioned about this peace plan. Recently, UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer announced that allies would prepare something sort of Gaza peace plan, use this plan as a possible example for ending the war in Ukraine. Leaders of the coalition of the willing will meet in London this Friday, also with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, and let's hope any kind of unified offer for Vladimir Putin made by UK, France, all European allies and the US would work to help Ukraine to reach a lasting and also great, lasting and fair peace.
Well, it certainly seems to be the case that the coalition of the willing, as it's been called, meeting in London on Friday, are looking at providing a structure for a stabilization force once the peace deal is signed in Ukraine, and Britain and others are prepared to put those forces on the ground. And one would hope that would give reassurance to President Trump that this is viable. I think also the European countries want to demonstrate to President Putin that actually, they are united. They are a very powerful military force, and Putin needs to stop poking the Europeans, as it were, because although in the past we've rather rolled over and obviously didn't intervene when Russia invaded Ukraine, I think we're in a very different position now, 3.5 years later. And I think European leaders want to make sure that Putin absolutely understands that. And European leaders want President Trump to understand that we will absolutely put a military force into Ukraine to support and maintain any ceasefire that's signed, hopefully in the near future.
Thank you, Colonel Hamish, for your time and for your support for Ukraine, and glory to Ukraine.
Thank you very much for having me, and glory to Ukraine.